Dear sisters and brothers from the Holy Land and from around the world, I welcome you at this moment to join our fellowship, our partner organizations, and all those who are committed to work for justice and peace in Palestine and Israel, and particularly to join our churches in the Holy Land on the occasion of the closing webinar of WCC's Olive Harvest Initiative. The World Council of Churches seeks a just peace in the Holy Land for both Palestinians and Israelis, and continues to accompany those people and communities who, due to injustice, violence, and occupation in daily struggle to exist in dignity and in their right to stay rooted in their lands, like their own olive trees. The story of the olive trees is the story of all people in the Middle East, whose culture, history, identity are threatened to be uprooted. It is the story of Palestinian people today. The world needs to hear and see this story so that silence is broken. One cannot build lasting peace without hearing the truth. Dear sisters and brothers, let us be daring in speaking the truth. Let us be daring in our accompaniment, even in times of common fragility. Let us also be daring in witnessing for hope. The people of this region, with their diverse ethnic, cultural, and religious backgrounds, have shared the same tradition, the same seeds, and the same land for their olive trees for centuries. It is only political forces that have uprooted their trees and divided their lands. The World Council of Churches will continue its mission for a just peace in the Holy Land, for equal rights for all, for a peaceful harvest for all. Let us pray together, work together, and break the silence of injustice also together.
Thank you very much, Father Salka, for starting this closing webinar for the Olive Harvest Initiative that you've mentioned. This is an initiative that has been designed to try to provide the same sort of accompaniment, or at least a different sort of accompaniment and support and protective presence to communities that are threatened and that do struggle in their daily life in the conditions of occupation in their region. In a context where the pandemic has prevented us from being physically present in the same way that has hitherto been the case for the almost 20 years of history of the Ecumenical Accompaniment Program for Palestine and Israel, we have had to try to be creative to try to do or achieve some of the same purposes, but in different ways. And the Olive Harvest Initiative has been an initiative designed to try to do that and to find alternative and additional ways of providing that protective presence and accompanying the communities concerned. So I'm very grateful to all of you who are joining us on this webinar, and who may view it after it has been recorded and presented in that form. So we start with a short video that provides some snapshots, some highlights of what has been observed and what has been produced during this Olive Harvest Initiative during the olive harvest season this year.
With the constraints of life under occupation, compounded by the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic.
Some of the challenges challenges we have is actually owning the land, yet is not ours. So this very, very hard situation for the Palestinians.
It is, again, it is a holy tree. It is the sign of peace. It is the sign of green. It is the sign of the holy land, the holy people.
With countless gifts of love, and still is ours today.
Thank you very much for this video, which helps us to get a little image of the Olive Harvest Initiative as we have experienced it this year. The initiative focused on this season, the annual olive harvest, for two reasons, two main reasons. One is the significance of this harvest to the livelihoods and to the culture of Palestinian communities in the region, but also because it's a moment in each year where there is typically an increased rate of harassment and restrictions and violence that impedes the annual olive harvest. So I would like to invite now a representative from the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights, Ms. Lan Xiao-Tsai, who can perhaps also give us a little overview of what has been observed during this period from the perspective of the UN Protection Cluster in the region. Lan Xiao, the floor is yours.
Thank you, and thank you so much for inviting me. Maybe I will just introduce the protection cluster for those who are less familiar with the humanitarian coordination system and the UN. So our office, as the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights, is responsible for the protection cluster in Palestine. In Palestine, the protection cluster is made up of 6 different clusters that are within the humanitarian coordination system. And this includes education, food security, shelter, health, and water, sanitation, and hygiene. So for the protection cluster, our membership is made up of more than 100 organizations, including the UN, international NGOs, as well as Palestinian NGOs. And we are focused on addressing violations of international human rights law and international humanitarian law, including child protection concerns, gender-based violence, mental health and psychological services in response to these violence, as well as legal aid. So for the protection cluster, each year, we have been, for more than a decade, have been coordinating the interventions of cluster partners. And this is because, as mentioned and as shown in the video, the olive harvest spotlights very serious protection risks and access issues faced by Palestinian farmers in accessing their land. It is fair to say that this has become a chronic situation that worsens every year, but 2020 was significantly more challenging because of a mix of different factors. So as some of you may have known, the halt in PA coordination in response to Israel's announcement that they will annex the West Bank resulted in a breakdown of communication between the Palestinian and the Israeli side that usually facilitates this access to their land because there is a need for prior coordination as a risk mitigation measure for settler violence and also due to restrictions imposed by the occupation. To compound this issue, just before the start of the harvesting season in mid-September, the Israeli military commander announced that he was closing about 300 hectares of Palestinian agricultural land, announcing them as closed military areas. And most of these land, these 300 hectares, were olive groves in 4 governorates in Hebron, Bethlehem, Ramallah, and Nablus. Also, as mentioned, due to the COVID-19 crisis and associated travel restrictions and lockdowns, there was no international protective presence in the olive harvest. Well, not as much as before. Usually we see a significant number of international volunteers fly in to participate in the olive harvest, but due to travel restrictions and quarantine requirements, it severely reduced the number of volunteers this year. And as we speak about the COVID-19 crisis, it's also important to remember that with the lockdowns and the lack of protective presence, we have already seen a spike in settler violence towards Palestinians since March and April. COVID-19 restrictions were also a concern in terms of movement restrictions, as a lot of places where Palestinian farmers' land are facing restrictions in terms of security concerns or COVID-19 lockdown concerns. And lastly, the Palestinian economy was under severe pressure from the COVID-19 crisis. For example, a survey by the Palestinian Central Bureau of Statistics looking into the socioeconomic impact of COVID-19 showed that 46% of households in the West Bank had their income reduced by more than half, and only a third of the household had income resources to cover their expenditures. So we went into this olive harvest with the pre-coordination and the work with our partners already quite worried about the situation, even though this is an issue that we deal with every year. 2020 was particularly severe. And this can be seen from the statistics. I think the video showed previously had statistics from UN OCHA. So just as an example, in the first 2 weeks of the olive harvest, we recorded at least 19 incidents of settler violence where 23 Palestinian farmers were injured and over 1,000 olive trees were burnt. And when the Israeli security forces intervene in clashes, it also results in further injuries. For example, in one incident, it injured 14 Palestinians and about 30 trees were burnt by tear gas. In addition to damage and settler violence, there has also been an increased trend that has been reported by our mental health and psychosocial services providers in response to settler violence of the phenomenon of settlers using sewage water to flood the olive fields and thereby managing to damage a lot of their harvest in a short period of time. So it's important to remember that settler violence, along with demolition, forced evictions, and a series of restrictive and discriminatory policies and practices are part of what we call a coercive environment, which may lead to forcible transfer, which is a grave violation of international humanitarian law. I think I will stop right here, and I hope this has been a good overview for our participants to give more detail based on their experience. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Lan Shao. That's extremely helpful, and I hope that we'll be able to share this recording very widely so some of the information and the data you presented can be made available to a much wider audience. Now, we have a panel discussion next, where we have 3 panelists who, building on the metaphor of the Olive Harvest Initiative, are going to be asked to reflect on the topic, uprooting identities or planting just peace. We have 3 panelists who are going to speak on this topic. Firstly, Bishop Hossam Naum of the Episcopal Church in the Holy Land, and then Ms. Sharona Weiss, International Advocacy Director for Yesh Din, and then Rabbi Ranan Malik of Rabbis for Human Rights, also a member of, like Bishop Hossam, of the International Reference Group for the Ecumenical Accompaniment Program in Palestine and Israel. I'm very grateful that all three can join us for this conversation and to contribute to this panel discussion. Each panelist will have approximately 5 minutes to reflect on this topic, and I invite Bishop Hossam to the floor.
Thank you. Thank you, Peter, for the introduction. And again, I greet each and every one of you in the name of our Lord Jesus Christ, here from Jerusalem, from the land of the Holy One. And I'm really delighted to share with you also the Advent greetings from the city of Bethlehem and from the Holy Land at this very special time, and also an exceptional time, of course, of COVID-19. Just looking at the title, of course, that you, Peter, just shared with us, and also the overall heading of the spiritual, economic, and cultural importance of olive harvest, I would like to share with you some of the small meditation about this topic from the Holy Land, and an expression of the Christian input into what has been already said about the statistics, and they're not simple numbers, but actually life of people and the livelihood of the people. Therefore, I would like to share with you some biblical importance and spiritual importance of the olive harvesting and the olive tree in general. You know, one of the most important things about olive trees is that they are an evergreen tree, which symbolizes life and the sustenance and growth. And also, it is really well known for olive trees that they are like hard-working trees, because they challenge the soil in which they grow, and their roots can go deep into the soil, even in the midst of a rocky ground. And the oil of the olive tree also symbolizes not only light that can be used for lamp, but also it is used in the biblical tradition for anointing kings, and is a very important symbol for the Messiah, and therefore is an important image for healing. You know, olive harvest in the Holy Land is a very special time. People may think that, you know, olive harvest can be like any other harvest. That's true, but there is a lot of emotions. There is a lot of embodiment of a very important tree in the life of the people who live in the Holy Land. We are talking about the livelihood, the economic situation that depends so much. So many farmers depend on this annual season of harvesting, and it's a source of income and sustenance for them in a land that is challenged on many levels. You know, for us as Christians, of course, the olive tree is a sign of peace and endured peace. It's a sign of life. It's a sign of light and healing for the world, and that is the importance that, you know, we are all invited into God's economy in order to understand what it means to live a life of peace, a life of justice for all people who are sharing this land we call holy. I would like to share with you a verse from the Bible, from Isaiah 2 verse 4, which reads, "God will judge between the nations and will settle disputes for many peoples. They will beat their swords into plowshares and their spears into pruning hooks. Nations will not take up sword against nation, nor will they train for war anymore." This is an important vision, of course, that Isaiah shares with us, and especially at this time of Advent season, where we are expecting the Messiah, that we are invited to ponder on these words. And it is not only a wishful thinking, but actually a lived experience where we are all called into a life of peace, and to think of peace as a holistic term, not as an exclusive term, but a term that embraces all of life and embraces all people who are invited to live into this just situation. And of course, it is an important image for all of us, because talking about swords and spears being turned into plowshares and pruning hooks, we are reminded at this season of olive harvesting that these tools are used during the season of pruning, and also of gathering all the fruits of the olive and the process of making them into oil or as olives for eating. These instruments of death are turned into instruments of growth and life. And to this we are called as Palestinians and Israelis to live within the kingdom of God as we work together for peace and justice and reconciliation, which are really, really important for us. And also in terms of the culture, and I reading the heading that is posted on the WCC websites, the aspect of culture is also important, because the olive tree culturally embedded within, I'm sure that Palestinians, especially Palestinians and Israelis, I'm sure in many other places, but for Palestinians, it's a symbol of life, a symbol of a great joy when people can reach their olive trees. And I would like just to share with you one of the sayings that is used within a Palestinian culture. And I grew up hearing this, and I would like to share it with you today, just for you to imagine how much the olive tree is actually rooted within the Palestinian and the Arab culture in general. And this saying says that an empty olive tree, no one comes near that tree, but actually the fruitful tree that gets beaten. And the term beaten here is used because how people kind of harvest the olives by actually hitting these branches in order to drop all these olive fruits into the ground. The meaning of that is that a fruitful tree endures suffering, but it is done out of its own graciousness and out of its own nature in order to feed others. And I think peace is very similar to that kind of olive tree, which tells us so much about how peace can be risky. It can be a dangerous path. It can be an adventure, but actually when it is achieved, it is beautiful, it is fruitful, and it gives life and light and healing to the world. These are the symbols that we are lived with and through when we come to olive harvesting. And the churches in Jerusalem here, and I can speak about the Anglican Church, among many other churches, we are people who believe in peace and justice and reconciliation for all people. Jerusalem is a very special place, and the Holy Land is a very special place. It is a holy place. And we also realize the importance of and the character of Jerusalem and the rest of the Holy Land, where three Abrahamic faiths live side by side, and they have done so for so many centuries. Like talking about like more than 14 centuries, 1,400 years, we live side by side. Unfortunately, politics can divide us as much as politics divide the same people sometimes. But we are called as people of the Holy Land, people of this very special and very precious place, to reimagine how can we all live under this olive tree that teaches us so much about who we are, first and foremost, but also, I would say the essence of it is to reflect on the God that brings us all into this place. We are all believers. We are all the children of Abraham, but we are called to really reflect on the purpose of our life and the meaning of life for us. And therefore, the Christian community today, I can say that, facing all these difficulties, and I'm sure that there are so many Palestinian farmers that also reach their lands and sometimes they can't. But the idea is that we as Christian communities faced with so many challenges, whether it is economic or whether it is the absence of peace, whether it is checkpoints, whether it is any kind of political challenge that we live in, but we are like the olive tree, we are rooted in the land. And we realize that even though the soil is a rocky one, yet the roots of our own roots, going back to more than 2,000 years, we believe that we need to be here. And I'm sure that you will find many Jewish people, many Muslim people would say that this land will not be the same without the Christian presence. Therefore, I ask you that we all reflect on this important season of harvest, to think about how much more we can gain from our own peace initiatives if we can harvest the fruit that is really can be realized by our peaceful efforts. And I can say that light, life, and healing is exactly what we expect from all this olive harvest. And this is exactly the similarly speaking, what we can harvest also from our peace initiatives. So I would like to thank you all for this opportunity, to thank for all those who are praying for all people in the Holy Land, not only Christians, not only Muslims or Jews, but to all, because we need to unite the people of this land in our prayer and not even to add more division through our prayers. May God bless you all, and blessed Advent, and to all those who are preparing for Christmas and Hanukkah, their times may be blessed.
Thank you very much, Bishop, for this lovely reflection and very encouraging and hopeful words that you've shared with us. I'm going to move to our second panelist, Ms. Sharona Weiss, who is International Advocacy Director for Yesh Din. Sharona, thank you so much for making the time available to join us. You've also heard what Lan Xiao had to present on behalf of the UN Protection Cluster. But from your point of view, in your work for a civil society organization that very much focuses on human rights, including of Palestinian communities during this period, it would be wonderful to hear your thoughts and your observations of whether during this period, during this time of harvest, we have been planting just peace, or whether we have been uprooting identities.
Thank you. And thank you, Bishop. I'm afraid that what I have to say will not be as moving as what the Bishop shared with us just now. As you said, I work with an Israeli human rights organization, Yesh Din, and we document settler violence throughout the year. But in particular, as Lan Xiao pointed out, the olive harvest is a time when this violence reaches a height in every year. But this year was particularly bad. I was involved actually on 3 levels, both in my capacity at Yesh Din, also as part of one of the organizers of a campaign called the Faza campaign, in which we were attempting to recruit local volunteers to accompany at-risk harvesters, several times in which those that were accompanying the harvesters were attacked by settlers, and as a photographer with the photography collective Act as Stills. Through my experience on all 3 of these levels, I would say that I must admit that it seems that we are uprooting identities more than working towards a just peace. I would say particularly uprooting the Palestinian agricultural falahin identity. As I said, the olive harvest is always a violent period in which we see harvesters and those accompanying them attacked. Last year, we thought was particularly bad, and we documented 28 such incidents. This year, however, we documented 42 incidents in which Palestinians were violently attacked or that their property was attacked, including 13 incidents of violence, direct physical violence, 12 incidents in which trees were uprooted, cut, or set on fire, 16 incidents involving theft of Palestinian crops, and 1 incident involving access denial to an olive grove by soldiers. As Lan Xiao pointed out, there were several reasons that even before the olive harvest began, we anticipated would create a perfect storm of factors. I think in addition to what she mentioned about the lack of international volunteers and the breakdown in coordination, we also saw that in the wake of conversations about annexation and formal annexation, which did not take place, we saw that settlers decided and were emboldened to try to change the facts on the ground. We saw this also playing out in the erection of multiple outposts, but also in an uptick in violence, especially during this harvest. In addition, the end to the coordination mechanism played a significant part, but I would also like to point out that this mechanism in and of itself is often used by the military authorities who allege that this is in order to protect Palestinians. However, it's often used as a way to take over increased tracts of land. Usually Palestinians must coordinate because the tracts of land that they own are in proximity to Israeli settlements and outposts, or in areas that are considered areas of friction, which essentially means these are areas where settlers are regularly attacking Palestinians. And then the Palestinians end up being paying the price for being victims. So their lands are closed off, and then it's required that they coordinate with the military authorities in order to receive permits, which, keep in mind, only give them access a few days a year, usually twice a year during the plowing season and the harvest season. They receive permits for a mere sometimes 3 days, which is not enough to harvest all of their olives usually, depending on how many olive trees that they have. This is why the presence of international volunteers is critical in addition to being a protective presence. But this year, all of that was lacking. In addition, many Palestinians did not want to turn directly to the military authorities, as they usually had district coordination offices, which were closed once the coordination ended. So for this reason, there was a lot of confusion, and there was an increase in clashes with settlers. And in addition, just for these tracts of land, when they are not being cultivated, they're at risk of being taken over by settlers. And the settlers know this. And so what we see is that the settlers will increase their violence, knowing that they're often rewarded with increased space to operate in, and it denies the Palestinians their right to property and their right to enjoy their own resources. In addition, we've seen in post olive harvest period, we've seen increased efforts that we see as de facto annexation, including hearings in the Knesset regarding land registration issues, and such. And all of this acts together to embolden the settlers. Before the olive harvest, we did send several principled letters to military authorities to urge them to protect Palestinians, but we did not see any significant efforts made on behalf of the military authorities for this. Several times during my participation in the Faza campaign, Palestinians were attacked, as well as those accompanying them, oftentimes by both settlers and soldiers who accompanied the settlers. There was one such incident that I actually witnessed myself in Huwara at the beginning of the olive harvest, in which we went up to land that was near the outpost of Yitzhar. And settlers began to toss huge, when we say stones, we're talking about very, very large boulders off the mountain at the harvesters and those accompanying them. And soldiers came, and instead of protecting the harvesters, as is usually the case, they began to throw tear gas and stun grenades on all of us. And this is just one incident that happens on a regular basis during the olive harvest, as well as during other periods of the year. What we see is that military authorities very often either stand by while settlers are committing these attacks, or they actually react against Palestinians who are landowners or who are harvesters. So this for me was a personal experience with what I am seeing and documenting on a regular basis in my work. And for me, I think that this definitely shows us that we need to do a lot more towards working for a just peace. In my work at Yesh Din, we see this every single day. I think that all of us need to be working towards a peace that respects the human rights of Palestinians, respects fundamental freedoms, and that will respect identities rather than uprooting them. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sharona. Well, as Father Salka said in his opening words at the beginning of this closing webinar, he said something to the effect that one can't build peace without seeing the truth. And what you have shared with us is a fairly comprehensive description of the truth from which we must build back better, as the saying goes these days. So thank you very much for sharing that with us, and thank you for the work that you do and that your organization does. So important. Now let me invite Rabbi Ranan Malek, our third speaker and last speaker in this panel, to also, and especially in light of what we've heard from Sharona, Rabbi Ranan, perhaps you could also especially address the issue of how do we begin to plant a just peace in the face of so many identities being uprooted. Rabbi Ranan.
Thank you, Peter. It's a pleasure to be able to address everyone in this forum. I address on behalf of Rabbis for Human Rights and the work that they've done over the past 18 years with assisting Palestinians throughout the land to help instill a just and fair future. It's been very difficult, and yet this season we were successful in having 20 harvest days with over 500 volunteers. We've done outreach to US Congress members and made a point of standing up against the annexation when that was a possibility. There is an important part of the work that we do, which is that much of the effort that the rabbis put in is based very deeply within Jewish sources. Denying the children of Abraham their right to enjoy the fruit of their labor contradicts the laws of robbery and lost property as set down by Maimonides. And Maimonides is accepted throughout the Jewish community. It's forbidden to rob even the slightest amount. It's forbidden to take anything from a Gentile. And the source goes on to even say, no matter who that Gentile is, if they are an idolater or not. But our sources are very clear in saying that the Muslim and the Christian people are very far from idolatry. More than that, the Meiri, a 13th century scholar, said that the Muslims and Christians are those that follow in the ways of religion, in the ways of God, and this must be respected and honored. And he gives examples of how the way that we treat Christians and Muslims should be the way that we treat the ger toshav, or the resident stranger. Far be it from me to indicate or to say that the Palestinian people are strangers of this land, very much to the opposite. They are the people of this land. It is them and their families that have planted the olive trees over hundreds of years and taken the fruit of their labor during these hundreds of years and fed the people of this land. And the land remembers. This is a land that requires justice to be done. And we must remember the words of Leviticus, of the Torah, that are very clear in saying that this is a land that does not belong to human beings. This is a land that belongs only to God. And it is up to him to give it to who he wishes. And how he decides who the land is given to is whether or not we stand up and are just in the way that we act towards the other. It is closed minds that have kept our two peoples apart for over a century now. And we can choose to live with that enmity or seek a way to change it. Salam and shalom between the Palestinian and Israeli people will not be achieved only by politics and diplomacy. And yet it will be achieved. It must. Like the Jews who returned to the Holy Land in the 18th and the first half of the 19th century, there are now a people living in inequality who seek a betterment for their lives and the lives of their children. And it may take many years for them to reach it, but they will reach it. And I and my colleagues at the Rabbis for Human Rights organization will be there to help, as well as Yesh Din and the other organizations represented by Israeli Jews and others who take a stand for the importance that lies at the core of what this land is about, which is that there should be justice and equality for all. The olive tree is at the core of the Palestinian identity, as we have heard from my esteemed colleagues tonight. To witness the harvest is an act of nonviolence that calls out for the equality and justice through the presence of being. I commend those that in the past have been able to participate in coming together to stand with the people of the land, with the Palestinians during their harvest. I commend my colleagues who were able to stand this year, even though there were so many difficulties in being able to do so. And I would like to bless those in the future that will arrive in the Holy Land and will be able to stand alongside for a future of justice and equality for all. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Rabbi Ranan. And let me take this opportunity to say how much we have appreciated during this initiative, partnering even more closely with Rabbis for Human Rights and drawing upon the observations and the materials and the images that you and your colleagues have been able to produce from your in situ accompaniment of the communities concerned. And I say that knowing that there are many people who will be listening to this webinar, former EAs, or maybe people who were scheduled to take up that opportunity of spending time with the communities on the ground and accompanying them, but were unable to do so because of current conditions. I think I speak on their behalf as well in saying that how important it has been to be present and to follow those developments through the work of you and your colleagues and others who are on the ground at a time when we cannot be. So thank you very much to you and to all your colleagues. And thank you to all the panelists, because I have to say that despite the litany of negative realities that we've heard of, I think the overwhelming impression that one gains from this conversation is one of hope and one of encouragement. So I thank you very much, all of you, for sharing those reflections with us. We're going to move towards some closing words now, but I do want to say that this webinar, this event is a close of a particular time-limited initiative that was designed to accompany this particular annual olive harvest season. But it's also our objective to derive from this experience lessons learned, new and better practices that enable us to be even more present, more effectively to accompany, and more effectively to advocate on behalf of all those who yearn for a just peace in their own homeland in the region. So we consider this initiative and the reflections that we will engage in afterwards, because there will be a working session after this public event. And I remind those who, all of you should have received, those of you involved should have received a separate link for that working session, where we will try to distill some of those lessons learned and reflections to assist us in our continuing work. But now we come to the end of this public event, and we have a pre-recorded message, closing words from Dr. Agnes Abuom, who is the moderator of the Central Committee of the World Council of Churches from Kenya, from Nairobi. So I want to thank you. Before we cue that up, I want to thank everybody who's participated, in particular to all those who've contributed as panelists or as speakers for this closing webinar. To thank you again for your contribution today, but most importantly, for the work that you do every day. Thank you.
Friends, colleagues, sisters and brothers around the World Council of Churches Olive Harvest Campaign for 2020 is drawing to a close. And I want to take this opportunity to thank all those around the world who have helped mobilize and highlight the deep meaning of the olive harvest as it holds for so many people, as well as the deep injustices it exposes. In the past months, we have seen and heard individual testimonies as well as stories of collaborative efforts among local churches, partners, and others working together for a peaceful olive harvest. And as we now look ahead, our efforts for peace for all people in the region will continue unabated. In the year 2013, the WCC's 10th Assembly reiterated the WCC's key role as the convener and facilitator of global ecumenical peace and advocacy work. The WCC member churches further committed themselves to raise their collective voice for just peace across many countries as expressed in the pilgrimage of justice and peace. The Olive Harvest Initiative, as one effort among many, has been one way to reaffirm this commitment. With already a very long history of engagement for justice and peace in the Holy Land, the WCC will continue to support member churches in the region in their witness and ministry, encouraging WCC member churches around the world to act in solidarity for peace with justice in the region, praying with and for them, accompanying people suffering under occupation, and advocating in the United Nations and other international forums for human rights, an end to the occupation, and a just peace for all. May God bless you all, and may God bless all our efforts for justice and peace as we journey on our pilgrimage of justice and peace together. May this Advent season be a blessed season, a peaceful season for all of us. Thank you so much.